While he's down, search him.
Get in the car. Bro, help! Stop. Get in there.
Well, y'all hurting me.
Get in the
Car.
That's my weapon is in my name. Bro, are y'all doing this?
The opening moments of this encounter are defined by urgency, confusion, and a rapid collapse of procedural discipline. From the very beginning, the situation moves faster than clarity can keep up with it. What starts as a routine traffic interaction immediately adopts the posture of a high-risk arrest, even though the foundational facts required to justify that posture have not yet been established. The officer's tone, their physical positioning, and their commands signal that a decision has already been made before the necessary verification occurs. At the core of this escalation is a fragile assumption. The stop is initiated for a minor traffic infraction, but almost instantly becomes anchored to a belief that the driver may be a wanted individual. This belief is not yet confirmed, yet it begins to shape every subsequent action. The distinction between suspicion and certainty collapses early, and that collapse becomes the engine driving the rest of the encounter. Bodycam footage shows how quickly authority can harden once officers perceive a threat, real or imagined. The driver attempts to assert boundaries, questioning why commands are being issued and why physical intrusion is occurring. Instead of slowing the encounter to reestablish legal footing, those questions are treated as resistance. This is a critical pivot point. In constitutional policing, questions are not defiance. They are often the natural response of a citizen attempting to understand their status. Here, however, inquiry is reinterpreted as obstruction. The language of detention appears before the legal threshold for detention has been clearly articulated. Officers use commands that imply custody while simultaneously withholding explanation. This creates a paradox for the individual being stopped. Compliance is demanded, yet the reason for that compliance remains unclear. In high-stress environments, ambiguity itself becomes a form of force. The person being detained cannot calibrate their behavior because they do not know what standard they are being judged against. As the encounter continues, the officer's focus narrows. Instead of verifying identity with care, attention shifts to control. Hands-on tactics are introduced rapidly, without the intermediate steps that de-escalation training is designed to provide. This is not merely a tactical failure, it is a cognitive one. Once officers commit to a narrative, this person is dangerous. This person is hiding something. New information that contradicts that narrative struggles to break through. The presence of a legally owned firearm becomes a decisive accelerant. Rather than prompting a pause to assess lawful possession, it is immediately framed as evidence of threat. This reflects a broader institutional tension in modern policing. The coexistence of legal gun ownership with officer safety protocols that are often triggered by the mere sight or mention of a weapon. The footage shows how easily that tension resolves in only one direction, toward force. Crucially, the driver repeatedly communicates compliance and attempts to explain. These statements do not slow the encounter, they intensify it. Officers interpret continued speech as agitation rather than clarification. This is a common failure point in high-conflict stops. Training often emphasizes command presence, but when presence turns into dominance, communication becomes one-sided. The result is a feedback loop where raised voices justify raised force. The physical struggle that follows is framed by officers as necessary, yet it emerges from their own refusal to clarify the legal basis of the stop. The driver's body language, audible distress, and repeated pleas indicate fear rather than aggression. Nevertheless, the officer's language labels his reactions as resistance. This labeling is not neutral. Once resistance is declared, it retroactively legitimizes force that might otherwise appear excessive. Mistaken identity sits at the center of this case, but it is not a simple clerical error. It is a systems failure layered atop human bias. The similarity of names becomes a substitute for confirmation, and that substitution is treated as sufficient grounds for detention, instead of pausing to verify date of birth, physical description, or photographic records before escalating. Officers move forward as though the match is already proven. This moment reveals a deeper issue in law enforcement operations. Databases are tools, not verdicts. When officers treat database hits as conclusive rather than provisional, the margin for error becomes dangerous. The footage demonstrates how quickly a possible match transforms into an assumed identity, and how little effort is required for that assumption to trigger violence. As the encounter progresses, the power imbalance becomes stark. The driver is on the ground, restrained, and audibly in pain. Yet the officer's language suggests that the responsibility for this pain lies with him. This rhetorical shift, blaming the subject for the consequences of officer action, is a familiar pattern in use of force incidents. It reframes coercion as inevitability. The legal concepts at play here are not abstract. Reasonable suspicion requires specific, articulable facts. Probable cause requires even more. The footage shows officers acting as though both standards have been met without ever clearly demonstrating how. Instead, authority substitutes for justification. Commands replace explanations. Physical force replaces verification. By the end of this phase of the encounter, the trajectory is set. What could have been resolved through careful identity confirmation has become a full custodial arrest accompanied by force. The damage, physical, emotional, and legal, has already occurred. And yet, the officers still do not fully understand who they have in custody. This first part of the story is not defined by a single dramatic mistake, but by a series of small decisions made under stress. Each decision narrows the officer's options, making reversal more difficult. Once force is applied, admitting error becomes psychologically and institutionally costly. The footage captures the moment where preserving authority takes precedence over correcting course. As the encounter continues, the consequences of early assumptions become unavoidable. The individual is now restrained, yet the officer's certainty begins to unravel. This is the most revealing phase of the footage, not because of what the officers do, but because of what they say. Conversations among officers and later explanations expose the fragile foundation on which the arrest was built. Verification begins late, and it begins reluctantly. The name discrepancy, once treated as sufficient cause for escalation, now requires clarification. This delay is significant. In lawful policing, identity confirmation precedes force whenever possible. Here, force precedes confirmation, and verification becomes a post hoc exercise designed to justify what has already happened. The footage shows officers grappling with administrative uncertainty. They discuss warrants, names, and database entries, attempting to reconstruct the decision-making process after the fact. This is not accountability. It is rationalization. Each new piece of information forces a recalibration, yet none of it undoes the physical reality already imposed on the detained individual. The presence of a firearm is revisited in a different tone. What was once treated as an immediate threat is now acknowledged as legally owned. This shift is telling. It demonstrates that the perceived danger was not inherent to the situation, but to the officer's initial interpretation of it. Once legality is established, the earlier level of force becomes harder to defend. The detained individual continues to explain his circumstances. His focus shifts from immediate survival to the broader implications of what has happened. He speaks about his family, his work, and the impact this arrest will have. These statements are not dramatic embellishments. They are attempts to humanize himself in a process that has stripped him of individuality. Institutional language begins to appear more prominently. Officers reference policy, safety, and procedure. These references serve a dual purpose. On the surface, they explain actions. Beneath that, they create distance. By framing decisions as procedural rather than personal, responsibility becomes diffuse. No single officer is at fault. The system itself becomes the actor. This diffusion of responsibility is a defining feature of misconduct cases. When everyone is partially responsible, no one is fully accountable. The footage illustrates how easily this dynamic emerges in real time. Each officer relies on the assumptions of others, creating a chain of reliance that is difficult to break. Legal thresholds are discussed indirectly, often without precision. Terms like resistance and detention are used fluidly, without clear alignment to statutory definitions. This flexibility benefits officers in the moment, but it undermines legal integrity. When words lose their specificity, they become tools of convenience rather than safeguards of rights. The emotional toll on the detained individual becomes more apparent as adrenaline fades. Pain, shock, and disbelief replace fear. He attempts to make sense of how a minor traffic stop escalated into violence. The officers, meanwhile, focus on closing the loop administratively, processing, charges, and documentation. This is where systemic failure becomes visible. The harm is no longer accidental. It is sustained through indifference. Even as doubts surface about identity and justification, the machinery of arrest continues. The individual remains in custody, and the narrative of resistance persists, because reversing course would require acknowledging error. The footage later includes officer explanations that reveal how the initial mistake occurred. Similar names, partial database matches, and assumptions about behavior converge. What is absent from these explanations is reflection on decision-making under uncertainty. The focus remains on what justified action, not on what could have prevented harm. This case illustrates how easily lawful authority can drift into unlawful conduct when safeguards are treated as obstacles rather than necessities. Verification is seen as something that slows action rather than something that ensures legitimacy. The result is a system that prioritizes speed and control over accuracy and restraint. By the end of this phase, the narrative is fractured. The officer's internal explanations do not align with the lived experience of the detained individual. One side sees a dangerous situation managed, the other sees an ordinary life disrupted without cause. This divergence is not resolved within the footage. It is deferred to courts, lawsuits, and public scrutiny. The final phase of this story moves beyond the immediate encounter and into its lasting consequences. The footage, once a record of action, becomes evidence. Every command, every delay in verification, every assumption is frozen in time. What was once justified as split-second decision-making is now subject to slow, methodical analysis. The legal aftermath underscores the gravity of what occurred. Claims of excessive force and unlawful arrest are not abstract accusations. They are grounded in the sequence of events captured on camera. The question is no longer whether officers felt threatened, but whether that feeling was supported by objective facts at the time force was used. This distinction is critical. Constitutional standards do not measure fear alone. They measure reasonableness. The footage invites scrutiny of whether a reasonable officer, with the same information, would have acted in the same way. The delays in verification, the rapid escalation, and the dismissal of clarifying statements all weigh heavily in that analysis. Beyond individual accountability, the case exposes institutional vulnerabilities. Training that emphasizes officer safety without equal emphasis on verification creates predictable outcomes. Policies that allow database ambiguity to justify detention create space for error. Supervision that reviews incidents after harm occurs, rather than preventing escalation, allows patterns to repeat. The personal consequences for the individual are profound. Employment, housing stability, and psychological well-being are all affected. These impacts extend beyond the moment of arrest, shaping months or years of recovery. The footage does not need to dramatize these effects. They are implicit in the disruption of an ordinary life. For law enforcement, cases like this erode public trust. Each documented error becomes part of a larger narrative about accountability and bias. Even when officers believe they acted in good faith, the absence of restraint undermines confidence in the system as a whole. The most sobering aspect of this footage is how preventable the outcome appears in hindsight. A slower approach, a clearer explanation, or an earlier verification step could have altered the trajectory entirely. Instead, momentum carried the encounter forward until harm became unavoidable. This story is not unique because of its details, but because of its familiarity. Similar patterns appear across jurisdictions: mistaken identity, rapid escalation, and post-incident justification. The footage serves as a case study in how authority, when unchecked by patience and verification, can cause irreversible damage. In the end, accountability is not only about punishment, it is about learning. Whether institutions are capable of learning from cases like this remains an open question. What is clear is that without structural change, the conditions that produced this encounter will persist. The camera does not take sides. It records. And in this recording, it captures the moment where power overrides precision, where certainty replaces caution, and where an ordinary traffic stop becomes a defining event in multiple lives.